Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. Thank you very much for taking your place, because we've only got 55 minutes ahead of us to talk around this table. We are going to be talking about reviving the economic debate. So what on earth do we mean by that verb? Is this something which we absolutely have to do? Is it urgent to do that? A lot of the French population are expressing their anger, if we could put it that way, and that's transpiring in the vote. So what we need to do first of all is take a snapshot of the situation today in France, in Europe, in the UK, in the United States, because we've got some panelists from the States. We're going to be addressing the question of defining what debate is, what are the requirements, who is participating in this conversation. We've got economists, citizens, politicians. And are there some parallel conversations going on? Are we really listening to what other people are saying? So it's a hot topic. And so how much are we talking about economics, and how does that weigh in with our political choices? We've got Madame TYSON, who's a high-level advisor. She's with us here today. She says she's been advising the American president, but although she's shaking her head to that. So we're together till 3:30 to talk about this issue. We've got Benoît, who's the coordinator of the roundtable. Hello to you, Benoît. We've also got Barry EICHENGREEN with us. You are a professor, economics professor at Berkeley University in California. Éric Lombard is with us also. He is the financial arm of the State Director General of the Caisse des Dépôts. Perhaps that brand, the Caisse des Dépôts, is not very well known, but you do a lot of things. Hello to you. You are a banker. You used to be an insurance executive, and you're very familiar with the world of ministries. Laura TYSON, economics professor at Berkeley, California University. Hello to you.
Please answer me. Please, were you not a member of the council? Yes. Okay, bien. Auprès du président Obama, n'est-ce pas?
So you worked with President Obama, is that right? You worked with President Obama? Oh, Clinton. François VILLEROY de GALHAU, governor of the French National Bank, the Banque de France. Clare WOODMAN is also with us. She's with Morgan Stanley for Middle East, Africa, and Europe. And so I'm going to hand the floor over to Benoît, who's going to kind of set the landscape for our discussion. Thank you very much, Alexandra. Hello, everybody. Just to introduce this debate on how we can start talking about economics again, I'm going to start by talking about the manner of John Robinson, Cambridge economist, Cambridge in the United Kingdom, not in Massachusetts. So the goal of learning about economics is not to get ready-made answers to economic issues, but to learn how you can how to avoid being misled by economists. And when we take a look at the economic debate here in France, Europe, and the rest of the world, there's a kind of a paradox here. On the one hand, over recent years, particularly during COVID and the energy crisis, economists have said that they could renew themselves, they could embrace new questions, that they could change their techniques using big data now, using real-time data as well, using machine learning to round off the traditional economics, whilst, of course, touching base with their roots. So, and the heritage of economic science is what the central banks are calling to our star. That dates back to 1930. So the entire debate on profit, inflation, greenflation have their roots in analysis by Kowalewski, the conflict between capital and labor, etc., etc., etc. So there's wonderful efforts being deployed by economists to renew themselves, to adapt, to update their science, to answer major questions for economic policy. However, at the same time, the public debate about economics has been full of ready-made answers. There are all kinds of charlatans about, and I'm referring to a book by Paul Krugman from 1994, which is called Peddling Prosperity. You may be familiar with that book. So the debate is full of all kinds of amazing references to economic theory. Sometimes they are references to other things. So this week, one of the election candidates has been accused of not being au fait with basic economics. However, when you interact with youngsters, when you talk with middle school children, high school pupils, etc., you know that they're very hungry to learn, and they're very sensible youngsters. And so we need to come up with the right answers for them. So as an economist, I would like to wonder if there's a question of supply or demand. Is demand not being properly formulated, or the economists just at a loss as to how to respond? Economists are partly responsible for this. They could talk in easier words. They could make a bigger effort. That they could be quiet on subjects they know nothing about. They could also better declare their conflicts of interest, because they do exist. They could limit or curb their actions to smaller tasks. Keynes used to say that economists were like dentists. Cyril Duflo said that they're more like plumbers, and so they should perhaps stick to what they know best. Another question which I'd like to put on the table is it something unique to France? When you talk with the political deciders here in France, one is often struck by a kind of indifference towards public finance. Some of them haven't a clue about what's going on generally in the economy. Everyone can remember Frédéric Bastiat, who said that state is like a work of fiction, and everyone tries to live in that work of fiction. That dates back to 1840, and it hasn't really evolved since then. We are struck by the ignorance of tax mechanisms when you distribute subsidies and to tenants, and that money goes to the property owners instead of to the tenants. There's a bit of a problem there. And one is also struck by a skeptical approach to the advantages of competition. And that begs the question of, is this unique to France? Do we find the same questions in the debate in the United States? And I'm sure that will transpire in our conversation here today. So what I can say is that these characteristics, through the political pair of glasses, from the right to the left and in the centre, they're all involved. So we've got all kinds of panel members here. I'd like them to come up with some concrete suggestions so we can enhance this debate. And Alexandra, the floor is yours in the meantime. Well, Benoît has pointed the finger at economists, politicians, and everything. I'm surprised he didn't mention social media or the media in general. So perhaps that will come up. So all of the participants here will have 5 minutes to make an introductory few words. And in the room, we really wanted to invite you to formulate your questions. We'll hand the mics out later on. This is an economic debate, and we want you to participate. We don't want you to just sit there dumbfounded to listen to the screen.
On va parler d'un débat économique.
Mr. EICHENGREEN, we've been talking about a breakdown in the conversation about economics. So what's your point of view in the United States? Can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing? Are there unique French characteristics, or is it the same in the United States? Do you see that no one's talking about economics, and we need to fix that?
Alexandra, thank you. I think everybody on the panel interpreted the prospectus we were given in different ways. So I saw our management asking 2 questions. Number 1, how can we make economic discussions more accessible? Number 2, how can we ensure that policy decisions are well informed? The subtext, I think, is that things are not going well in the economic sphere. Citizens see economists' characterization of the economy as out of touch with their reality. Economists counter that economic misinformation and misunderstanding are widespread. Economists have always found it difficult to shape policy. These problems have been with us for a long time, but if anything, they're even worse than ever today. So I want to argue to the contrary, that this diagnosis is too dire. In fact, economists have a number of channels for influencing public opinion, but our efforts to use them are hobbled by two structural problems. Examples of the channels I have in mind are Project Syndicate and the Clark Center Experts Panel. Project Syndicate was created about 3 decades ago by a New York University professor to try to get economic opinion into the newspapers, into the informed public sphere. It now has 82 regular economic columnists, and its columns appear in 500 media outlets in 56 countries. The columns are widely read. I can attest to that from the comments, not a few of them hostile, that I get to my own columns. The Clark Center panel was created by a couple of University of Chicago professors. They send out a question every week, and 50 US economists send in an answer. There's now a European panel that works in parallel, and the answers are put up on a website for all to see. This was a response to the belief that economists can't even agree amongst themselves, where in fact, if you look at these answers, often there is in fact a high degree of consensus among professional economists. So the opinions and analyses disseminated by these platforms are well informed, they are accessible, the platforms are overseen by reputable scholars who seek to be inclusive, but also exercise quality control. So in the past, this would have been the end of my story, but I have 2 worries, 2 additional elements. Number one, the internet has eroded the effectiveness, the dominance of the gatekeepers. So we now have a proliferation of blogs, Substacks, podcasts that are a source of economic information and misinformation. And this enables a kind of Gresham's law where the bad information drives out the good information. So you only need to compare what is written on cryptocurrencies, for example, on Project Syndicate and the Clark panel with what you will see elsewhere on the internet. That is not a problem we economists can control, unfortunately. We have to continue to use our platforms as effectively as we can. But there is also a second problem that we can control, which concerns attitudes and practices in the academy, in the university. So too many scholars at leading institutions ascribe value only to technical research published in so-called top 5 journals using highly technical methods that are inaccessible to many fellow economists, much less to the general public. There's a high degree of intellectual and methodological conformance. Acceptance of scholarship by these top 5 journals is controlled by a small group, a small cabal, if you will, of scholars who share the same intellectual and methodological preferences. We teach our students that the way they get ahead, the way they get tenure at top universities depends entirely on publications in these top journals. So that encourages them to do technical research inaccessible to the general public and to work on questions that are answerable, amenable to the latest methodology, not questions that are important from a current public policy point of view. Worse yet, there is a tendency to dismiss colleagues who write newspaper commentaries or horrors, even worse, books, as not qualifying as economic scientists because their work is not sufficiently technical. I can recall an earlier generation of economists on the left and on the right, Paul Samuelson, Milton Friedman. Others would write for general interest magazines and were respected in the profession. Alas, I think the same is no longer true today. So this last is a problem that we academic economists can begin to change by modifying our own training, our own hiring and promotion practices. We can alter the incentives faced by the next younger generation of scholars. So I think to heal our broken economic dialogue, our broken economic commentary, we first have to heal ourselves.
Je retiens.
Okay, so I've noted this notion of economists that have to, first of all, work on what they do themselves. You can't combat fake news on the social networks before that. And you really need to listen to what the population wants. So, Éric Lombard, let's start with that notion there. There is a paradox here. Benoît was saying that economists think they're doing well, and when they comment the media about growth, which is okay, employment is doing better than in 2017, for example. But in reality, there's another debate. And this transpires in the polling booth. When we're talking about purchasing power, people seem to be growing poorer. There's a paradox here. It's like two planets who, or more than two planets, in fact, who are kind of chattering away but without listening to the other one. So as academics and business leaders, from your point of view, have we failed in some things? You're saying we have to revive the economic debate. Should we, in the first instance, identify what we've done wrong? Well, I don't know if there's stuff we've done wrong or badly, but last Sunday, the French population was saying to us that the situation is not good, so we can start from that point, if you like. So I heard what Benoît was saying, and I would cite Bertolt Brecht, who said that when the people votes against the government, you have to dissolve the population. Well, that's been done. We've done that here in France. And there's a kind of a consensus here in Aix, all of these wise people, the intellectuals, the academics. We think that we've talked about unemployment, which is the problem of our generation, purchasing power, inequality in revenue was from 1 to 20 before the transfer, and since the transfer it's been from 1 to 5. So we thought we'd settle that problem of inequality. But what people are telling us now is that that is not the case. So it's painful for me in my job as Chief Executive Officer in the role that I play, because accommodation, for example, it's very hard for our citizens. They can't find housing. There are over 2 million people who are waiting for council housing. Véronique earlier on was talking about this at length. The lack of housing is really important, and it makes life very hard for our citizens who are looking for a job, for example. So as for town planning is concerned, we've really reworked that. Without going into detail, we've got 230 middle-sized cities and towns who've received investments of billions of euros. However, the population feel that they've not been paid attention to. So we've got 2,700 houses for public services in all parts of France where there's services, but the French population feel they're not having access to these public services. 7,000 contact points for the post office, 17,000 throughout the country, but the French people can only see those that have been closed or sent elsewhere. And what about the high-speed internet? We are the country with the most cable, but 80% of the 19 million premises in the countryside are not connected to fiber, and people feel that they are left by the wayside. And let's not talk about the lack of mixed populations, etc. The French people think things are not going very well, and that anything that's done by the state is to the benefit of someone else, but not them. So it's not enough. And more serious still, I've talked about local territorial politics there. We see that National Education Board is not fulfilling its role in society. We're talking about medical deserts here in France, and the entire country has become a medical desert. Our hospitals do care for acute conditions very well, but when you're in an emergency situation, the situation is very much different. So we've got this market situation, which is a bit the dominating model here that everyone here in Aix is talking about. In fact, that model is perceived by the French population as creating inequalities. Why, you might wonder? And Thomas Piketty, I'd like to refer to another famous economist and his work on the country. For many decades now, he says, real interest rates have been positive, and when that is the case, those who have property getting richer, and those who have no property will have lost all chance of ever having some kind of property. So once you can control inequality in revenue, the inequality in property remains absolutely huge, and that situation is not changing. I'm not going to mention anybody's name here, but this question here is about perception, how different people perceive things. So the answer to that is very complex, of course, and this is where I think we need to get that economic debate flowing again. It's all about regulating our economy. It's not regulated properly at the moment. I haven't mentioned the biggest challenge ahead of us, that is ecological and energy transformations. At all of these subjects, we have an explanation which is a bit tricky. The yield of capital is too high in order to reduce inequality and to fund the ecological transition. We had a roundtable on that this morning, and they said that the ecological transformation is not going to generate a lot of wealth. We're going to replace different energy sources. They're just transfers. It's not going to create any wealth. And so I would like to end by mentioning another economist, Patrick Artus, an economist who wrote that to fund the ecological transformation, businesses are going to have to reduce the remuneration they give to their shareholders. I think this is the crux of the matter. It's very complicated because it's not by taxing that we're going to correct the situation, because taxation increases the cost of capital. So we all have the duty to create a new consensus. In the coming years, the people in power have to manage to make that rebalancing act, and I think we have some road to go on that front. Thank you very much for listening. So we have to come up with new ideas to re-spark that conversation, saying, for example, as Éric Lombard was saying, that we have to create a new consensus about what we need to reach in terms of the yield of capital. So Laura Tyson, perhaps this new idea might appeal to the youngsters, and you have you've talked to students, and you've talked to the leaders of America. So the youngsters are the key.
Young people. Tout ça, ça dépend de comment on parle.
It depends how we talk to young people. That's the way we're going to get that economic debate up and running again. Is that right?
My understanding of what this panel was about, and my bringing to the panel is years of experience teaching undergraduates who know very little about economics. And actually, I would say that my ability to do that translated into my ability in Washington, because I could take simple economic concepts and explain them to members of Congress, senators, to people who lived and ran agencies but really did not understand basic economics. So I really want to emphasize that point. I want to start also by saying I completely agree with everything that my colleague Barry said about some of the blame here is economists themselves. Economists like to talk to other economists. And when they talk to other economists, they use their own vocabulary. It's become more and more technical over time. So it's harder and harder for my economics to be understood by someone who's an economist 30 years younger than I, who is doing much more complex technical modeling. So I will start by saying economists bear some responsibility here. On the other hand, I do not think my view of an economist as an advisor to a politician is the politician decides what the goal is. How much housing there is, how much health care there is, how much education. That's not the role of the economist. The role of the economist is to look at how to achieve most efficiently, least costly, most effectively the goals. So now let's think about the goal that you just talked about. So we have seen over the past 35 years a massive decline in the advanced industrial countries in public investment in infrastructure. Yesterday we were talking with the Germans about their rail system, the hospital system you mentioned. Societies, politicians, and your societies have decided not to invest in these things, but instead to invest in beautiful private housing, in beautiful private vineyards, in beautiful private farms, and private everything. So private capital has gone up a lot, and public capital has gone down. That's not because of economists. That is a political decision. That is a political decision. Let me mention another thing here. You sort of said, not taxes. Well, you know, if there's going to be public infrastructure investment, it has to be funded somehow. It has to be funded somehow. So in the United States, where we pride ourselves on having low tax rates and low tax revenues as a share of GDP, you know how we're funding it? Because we can, because we have the dollar. We're funding it by huge deficits. The rest of the world is funding it, okay? Societies have to decide how much revenue to the state, how much public investment to the state. Those are not decisions of economists. Economists, I would say, advise politicians on how to do that well. Now let me talk about one other area, and that's externality, climate. Economists know, and have been saying this for a very long time, and it's all in all of the pieces that Barry referred to. Take economists on the left and the right in the United States. Yeah, they know that we should be pricing carbon. They know that we're creating a massive climate change externality for the world. You know, economists agree on this. Nobody's listening, or very few people are listening. The political leaders are not listening. And so I just want to sort of emphasize, I think economists can be very important, but they are not the political actors. And I'm going to end here by just an anecdote of when I became the advisor to President Clinton. I had chaired his Council of Economic Advisors. That change occurred in essentially the end of a calendar year. All of the economists in the Council of Economic Advisors were signed on to stay for the next half year. So I inherited all of the economists from the Bush administration. You know what? It was absolutely fine. We all agreed. We all agreed. There wasn't any debate about the recommendations of the Council of Economic Advisors. Yes, there was a debate. President Clinton wanted to do different things from President Bush, but to the extent that we were giving common advice, say on healthcare, common advice, we were doing the same thing. So I will leave you with that, but I also want to leave you with a plug for one of your great economist books, which I understand I read it, and I think it's a very important book, very relevant to the conversation we're having. Jean Tirole is sitting in the front row, Economics for the Common Good. Economists can think about the return to society. They can think about externalities. They can pose policy options. It's up to the political leaders to listen.
On a déjà abordé là le...
Well, I think that what we're saying is that it's an economic debate that we need to fix. So, who's to blame? And how can we fix things? François VILLEROY de GALHAU. Now, back to you. Éric Lombard, earlier on, said that we need to draw up a new economic consensus. As Madam TYSON said, the policymakers should listen more to the economists. Is that the point we arrived at? What would you say about this? And the question is, do you think we can arrive at this consensus? Is this realistic altogether, or is it just wishful thinking? Thank you, Alexandra. Good afternoon, one and all. I always enjoy being here in Aix, but since I'm a policy representative, you will see that the date, well, the theme given the situation today in France is a topical issue. And yet, as you know, I have a duty not to talk about French politics today. Now, Alexandra, in your question, I think you were talking about the timeless aspect of this, the timelessness of this issue. And that's what I'll come back to, that is this dialogue, the interaction between the economic experts and the general public. Now, to simplify things, I'd say that in the past, experts were the ones who were dominating. They were the ones who were talking, and then the citizens were listening, and they had to do with them. Benoît gave us another image, the image of the dentist, Keynes' image of the dentist. Let's think about the taxpayers at the dentist. Well, it's not that comfortable in this seat, is it? You can't act and do anything about it. And then there's this situation that we're experiencing today. But the experts and the general public live in two different worlds. The economic experts are talking to themselves during high-level scientific colloquia, but nobody understands. Or they can talk about the most recent events and then shout at each other and say awful things about each other, or in columns. But today, I don't think that economy really trickles into the economic debate. So is there a solution for us in the future? Could we consider more interactions, fruitful interactions between the experts, the knowledgeable ones, and the taxpayers? Since you were talking about wishful thinking, I hope we'll be able to create something out of that. Yet we have to be realistic. And then I would like to consider another way that we could follow. But we need two conditions plus two. Two conditions that are on the supply side and two on the demand side, to reuse the image used by Benoît. By the way, there's something I'm totally certain about, and is that there's a huge request for economic information that is open to all. I'll give you some examples. First, the two conditions on the supply side from the economic experts or the economic institutions, if you will. Now, it boils down to one simple thing, is to respect people and the population. This is what people are looking for, that they should be respected. It's the prerequisite. The first prerequisite is therefore to talk about economics in a simple language that everybody can understand. And that's a complicated thing to do, let's admit it. I'm not going to mention Bertolt Brecht, but Paul Valéry. And he said, what is simple is always fallacious. What is not is useless. So it's in between these two quotes from Paul Valéry, or sentences, that economists have to study. I agree with Barry in what he said about the economists that have to make an effort to talk about the general public. Samuelson in the 40s. There's Jean Tirole, who's with us. Given what he did with the economy of the common good in 2016. Jean, I think I'm right in saying that talking about economy in simple words requires a lot more work. And when I talk about the monetary policy, I start with this type of trade-off with the experts from the Banque de France, because my intention is to try and simplify the message. Now, the second prerequisite or condition is to accept to challenge things and to accept the fact that people might disagree. Now, there are tricks. For instance, reversal of conferences, that is, you start with questions and not the general presentations. The diversity of audiences. I always try and do this whenever people come to me. I focus on the youth and the audiences who will not necessarily agree with our policies. And if I may as well, what we did is that we made quite a lot of efforts at the Banque de France in this sense, and we could do a lot more, I suppose. But since 2021, we've had these monetary policy meetings. Everybody's thought, okay, that's for the general public. We're trying to answer questions about the monetary policy, and that's going to be a flop. But last year we did this, and we had 750,000 views on Twitter, plus 17 in-person meetings. And also We have videos called On parle cash. Let's talk about cash. There was one on inflation. Why should we have the 2% objective? 550,000 views. So you see, that's some type of evidence that really shows that there's a demand. And then what we did is EducFi, economic and financial education. We have what we call a passport for all the schoolgoers aged more or less 12 or 13. And finally, if you've not seen the Cité de l'Économie in Paris, go there. And there's also Cité Cours, which is online. We could do a lot more, I know, but that's one of the things we do. And I can tell you that each time we did something or wanted to do something, people said it's not going to work. But there was a massive expectation from the general population. Now, back to the two prerequisites concerning demand, that is the media and the taxpayers, the population. Prerequisite number 3, don't just discard experts because they are the experts. Because in the past, people had to listen to the experts because they were the ones holding knowledge. That's one argument, but you shouldn't discard them altogether because they have the knowledge with them. Sometimes we have to focus on facts. There are economic facts, and the Banque de France will always remain an independent body, and I believe more in facts rather than economic laws. This is an expression I don't like. It's economic facts or evidence. That's when you can come up with arguments and make political choices. But then we have to focus on the facts and stick to them. And that's the whole debate on statistical data. Some people have feelings about purchasing power, about inflation, which is not what you can see in statistical data. So rather than looking at averages, we should look at distribution of data sets. The fourth condition, the fourth prerequisite on the demand side still, but I think that's when supply and demand meet, is to have an ethical approach based on dialogue. And it's very practical. Dialogue goes against two other words that are more fashionable, which is, first, people who put forward arguments that are almost like rude things that they say to each other, and then those who just want to talk for the sake of it. But these are monologues. A dialogue is different. A dialogue is an exchange of views. People who put forward their arguments, they talk about likely solutions, and they explore trade-offs so that people can act. This is what we have to find again. Gilles Finkelstein, in his book in 2016 called Piège d'identité, was saying the following, I'll quote, and others said the same, that is, in a given democracy, it's easier to have a dialogue and find trade-offs on what you have rather than what you are. These are the identity politics pitfalls that we have to be aware of, which means that we have to be in this position to exchange views, discuss and find trade-offs on economic and labor-related issues. Is it wishful thinking? Is it the dream that we have here in X? I don't know. But what I'm certain of is that this is a must from the economic point of view and a must in terms of our democracies as well. Thank you. Now, Clare WOODMAN, who's the head of Morgan Stanley, Clare WOODMAN. Now, what you deal with is the bankers, the regulators. What about your snapshot? What would you say about this debate, the economic debate? Do you have such debates in your world? Is it satisfactory, given what we've said about what the general public expects?
Thank you, and thank you. This is my first time here, and it has been fantastic to be able to exchange thoughts and ideas with everybody in such a really wonderful, relaxed environment. I'm going to take a slightly different tack from some of our panelists, but through my remarks, you'll hear that I think the principles and frameworks from economics are definitely alive and kicking in our businesses and in the corporate world and in financial institutions. But just a couple of comments to just set the scene. We all know that we need much more effective pro-growth policies in Europe to bridge the gap to the US. And we know that from the past decade and a half, GDP growth has been lower here than it has been in the US. When we look across all industries and sectors and markets, what we do see is that greater integration, increased harmonization are clearly going to be key enablers to foster growth, innovation, and higher productivity, which is what is absolutely required in the euro area. And that is going to help bridge the gap to higher growth rates. Banks play a critical role in this. We really are the engines in the system that intermediate the flow of capital between suppliers of capital and those needing capital. Don't worry, I don't have any quotes from Adam Smith here. So, and in the EU, it's well known that over 75% of corporate borrowing is sourced through the banks, as opposed to in the US, where there's a much more diversified source of funding and market-based finance plays a role. And that's notwithstanding what we've seen in terms of the evolution of financial markets and the growth of private markets, the growth of private credit. So whilst we see that slow evolution, it's still fair to say that bank lending is still the key provider of capital for corporates, for households, for industry. And I will say that banks themselves have been on a long journey in the past decade and a half to really evolve their business models to become significantly more diversified, sustainable, resilient, and profitable. And profitability is absolutely key. They've also learned to really deal with uncertainty. And how have we done that? We've transformed ourselves significantly in the last 20 years. Management teams in banks are much better equipped, taking the tools from the school and the science of economics and from financial modeling, from statistical analysis, to really help really advance our risk analysis. The fusion of economics with psychology has also been really helpful for businesses, and not just banks and financial institutions, in really trying to understand and model not just consumer and client behavior, but also how markets and market participants might behave in different types of scenarios and situations. So taking all of that, and of course always having oversight and checking the inputs, and then really stepping back and questioning the outputs of all of that modeling has really helped, and there's a real key net result. And that net result is that, in my view, and if you look at the capital held within the entire financial system in Europe, banks are far better managed and far better resilient and sustainable. But we need policymakers to help further. And the ECB and all of the central banks across Europe have really played a role in helping to harmonize regulation and help to make markets more consistent. However, there is significantly more to do. So if policymakers were listening, Alexandra, I would really say that we really must see active sponsorship of initiatives like Capital Markets Union to bring down some of the existing barriers across Europe, because this will have the effect of reducing the cost of capital that Éric referred to earlier. And I really think that that fragmentation and that friction is really key, because it is that cost and the yield on capital that ultimately is passed on into the real economy, to businesses, to consumers and households. So they would be my asks, Alexandra. But before I finish my remarks, can I take us back to where we started this panel and to Laura's comment, which is around financial education. And financial education is absolutely key. Initiatives like the passport are really important. But what the academic analysis and evidence is actually showing is that we form our ideas and our views around money and our relationship with money much earlier than in our teens. In fact, actually, in our primary years. So what we really must do is start to think about how we can provide financial education in a way that, as Laura said, brings it down to the individual micro decisions that people have to make every day.
Right. No, not that bad. We have 10 minutes for the Q&A. Anybody like to pick on that? Right? François, VILLEROY de GALHAU. Please raise your hands if you have any questions. Let me see. 1, 2, 3, 4 questions. Right. So, François first. François VILLEROY de GALHAU, and then 4 questions in a row. Right? And then the panelists will answer these 4 questions. Let me clarify something about the interest rates. Again, the central banker, I'd like to react to what Éric said. The real interest rates, that is difference between the nominal rate and inflation rate. Well, they were negative, you see, for many years that have elapsed. By the way, thank you, Claire, thanks to the central bank, that they've lowered the interest rates. But by and large, between 2012 and 2022, there were negative rates. So what's ahead of us is not positive real interest rates, which is the case today because we have to fight against inflation. But what Éric said is that this decrease in interest rates has not triggered a decrease in the cost of capital, that is the yield or return on investments or the cost of equity. Sorry, but I had to clarify this point. And I'm not going to talk about the R star, which is the neutral interest rates that Benoît brushed upon when he started his lecture. Okay, yes, please. Now, the Q&A. Madam, please. We have mics in the room. A quick question, please. So we have 8 minutes to go. Yeah, let me build on that. What Mr. Lombard said, the quote he gave us with de Lincoln, who said, when the people is fed up with the constitutional law, they will exercise their revolutionary right to dismantle the government, put it down. Now, that's the case when I see Le Pen today and arriving in the economic debate. I'm wondering if it's enough, because we're in the midst of a real existential crisis. The debate is complicated because we no longer focus on economy and social matters that are important for the general population. And personally, some of the French consider that the state owes them their happiness or good life. So there's a moment when we have to change this curse and we have to focus on good information. At present, I think we don't focus enough on people and what they can do for themselves. It's complicated. If everybody's entitled to whatever they want in life, we'll never manage. Okay, 2 hands up. 3 hands. And yes, please, madam, as well. I'm the timekeeper. We can't have all the questions. There's a lady there and a man there. No, you, sir. Sorry, I'm sorry. And that's all. Yes, madam. And then yes, sir. We'll see if we've time enough afterwards. There was a woman there, a hand up in the air. Yep, over there.
New Yorker. I have a simple question for the panel, is that I'm trying to understand what is the monetary policies behind the fact that French people can only spend $1,000 cash, and that when they want to withdraw money from their bank account, they have to go through almost like a DNA questionnaire forms to have access to their money. These kind of policies wouldn't be able to be done in America. So I wanted to know, from the banker's point of view, from the economist, what is the advantages of doing that to stop circulation? Because if I'm to buy like a bottle of water in France, the fees for Visa and MasterCards are going to be higher than the product itself. So that's my question.
Okay. Allez, encore une.
Yet another one. Short questions, please. Yes, please, over there, and then over there. Can you hear me right? Yep. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I have a quick question to ask. I'm Ibrahim. I was born around Marseille, in the poorest district, and you were talking about connecting worlds and reviving the economic debate. What can you do? You're very important people. What can you do from the executive point of view so that we can hear you? For those, I mean, who don't want to listen to, or it's sometimes complicated for us to trust you, you see. And yet another question over there. Who's standing up? Good. Right. Short question, please. 4 minutes to go. Now, number one. Since there's quite a lot of quotes, Nietzsche was saying, I'll quote, "What makes people crazy is not doubt, but it's certainties." End of quote. Which means that we have to keep a low profile when we look at what's happening around us. That's my first message. Number two. Many have talked about housing, the difficulties we have in France. I have a simple suggestion to make so that we take a little distance. It's very simple. Let's get rid of taxes on rents. Number two, let's get rid of any taxes on capital gains on property. And number three, when people have a problem with their tenants, they could get rid of them. Well, I know that some will not agree. Okay, anyway, that's a debate. That's a debate. I'm almost done, almost done. I have a question to ask. I have a question. And with this, I can tell you that then everybody will invest in housing. And my third point, and that's going to be a question connected to the first debate we had. Let me finish, please. Some people said the problem is that all the economists have different views. And people talk about this on social media. So my question is, what are the sources of data that we can trust? Okay, excellent question. Thank you very much. Thank you. So, Mr. EICHENGREEN would like to answer. Mr. Lombard, Barry EICHENGREEN, would you like to answer that?
To respond to Ibrahim very quickly, there's a lot of angst in France about economics and economic conversation. You should feel better. There is no meeting like this one in the United States. We have the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the 1%. We have the Aspen Institute, which is the 1%. Ibrahim reminds us that there is more than the 1% here.
Éric Lombard.
Éric Lombard, 3 quick comments. First, to answer the lady there who thinks that the French want to change the government. By the way, that's almost done. And Ibrahim, that comes from underprivileged districts around Marseille that I know well. Now, the answer is something that we failed with, is the local dialogue that we need to have so that the taxpayers can talk about their policymakers, the ones they elected, the ones they chose, to talk about policy, the policies that are good for them. That is the last mile type of policy making. What we do at a local level, it's not done correctly. Now, to talk about housing, so you were talking about the existing flats and rents. The main problem is the price of land. And in the years to come, it's going to be worse. To inshore factories, that's one of the most important topics, is the price of land. Okay, we're going to have a round of applause at the end. Madam Tyson, please.
I'll address 2 questions. The question from Ibrahim, and I would say that, again, we're not making policy here. So here are some policy ideas that seem to work in other environments. Sector-specific training programs work well in the United States. If you're near a city or near a place where there is an industry, you go and you get training specific for that industry. That's a policy, and economists have looked at that policy and say, yeah, that one actually works, okay? To go to the land, to the apartments, again, this is not our role to make policy here. I will say, when I used to teach Econ 1, the first thing I would start with was rent control, because students in Berkeley benefit from rent control. And that means that there has been much less investment in housing in the community because the rents have been controlled, okay? And I tell the students that, and I say, well, if you're for rent control, the consequence is going to be less supply. Same thing on tax. What I said to students, and I will say to you, put a tax on anything, you're going to discourage it. You will discourage it. So I use for the students, very important source of death for teenagers in the United States is drunk driving. If you increase the tax on beer, there's less beer, less drunk driving deaths. So I would go to your point. Yeah, taxes will have the effect, if you put a tax on something, of increasing its cost. That is what an economist would say. That it's up to the policymakers to decide what they want to do.
Peut-être un mot.
Now, a quick word, yes, very quick, please, to react to the person from New York about the fact that it's difficult to get cash from the ATM if it's more than $1,000 because it's AML regulations, anti-money laundering practices we have in the US and in Europe. And that's why there's a cap. And otherwise, you have obligations to declare. And I think it's a good thing. But I think you highlighted something else. That is, if you need to have the digital or bank card account, you shouldn't have to pay for bank fees that are too high. Well, you know what? Competition is really good. And we're looking into this. And also is to develop European technologies like the digital euro currency. We no longer have time. Well, so I'll continue. Ibrahim, the poorest district around Marseille. Maybe I'm going to surprise you, but at the Banque de France, what we do usually is that we work on economic and financial information and people who have a debt that they can't repay. We talk to the social workers, the teachers, but also we reach out to the local populations, and we're going to do more in the future. Thank you very much. We'd like to thank the coordinator. Now, stay with me. From 4:30 to 5:30 at the Librairie Fnac, there will be Artus and Marie-Paul who will be signing their books, and Jean-René Lorenzi and Villemeur for their books on salaries and